Did you finish?
The clerk will proceed with reporting the motion.
Mr. Dale of Massachusetts moves that the managers on the part of the House at the conference on the disagreeing votes of the two houses on the Senate amendment to the bill, H.R. 1, be instructed to 1. Disagree with Section 11081 of the Senate amendment relating to climation of shared responsibility payment for individuals failing to maintain minimum essential coverage, and 2. Received from Section 1303 of the House bill relating to repeal of deduction for certain taxes not paid or accrued in a trade or business.
The House is not in order. All members take their conversations out of the chamber and clear the aisles. Pursuant to Clause 7 of Rule 22, the gentleman from Massachusetts, Mr. Neal, and the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Brady, each will control 30 minutes. The chair recognizes the gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I ask for unanimous consent to give members 5 legislative days to revise and extend their remarks.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And with that, I yield myself 4 minutes.
The gentleman is recognized.
This could be a long few days if they can't agree on a motion to go to conference. That's not exactly the most heightened controversy we have. But, Mr. Speaker, I want to stand in support of the Democratic motion to instruct conferees on the Ryan McConnell tax package and in strong opposition to the Republican tax plan. Behind me is a replica of the national debt clock. This clock was just reconfigured. New features have been added just in time for the Republicans to acknowledge that they are about to add $1 trillion to this national debt clock, which they tortured Democratic presidents on for years about the debt. So let me provide you with some historical perspective.
The House is not in order. Members should take their conversations out of the chambers and clear the aisle.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Gentleman will proceed.
So let me provide some historical perspective. In January of 2001, when Bill Clinton said goodbye, we were looking at a $5.4 trillion surplus, 4 straight balanced budgets, and record economic growth. CBO said that the surplus might even go beyond $5.6 trillion. But what really happened during that period of time? After the Bush administration left, we were staring at $6.1 trillion worth of debt. So what happened? In 2001, the Republican Party cut taxes by $1.3 trillion and said it was all about economic growth. And then they came back in 2003 and said, well, the growth hasn't been substantial enough, so we're going to cut taxes by another $1 trillion, $2.3 trillion of tax cuts, and a repatriation tax holiday where the money is returned at 5.25% on the promise of economic growth and job creation, none of which happened. So where are we tonight? We're back to the same old pattern and playbook that they continue to utilize. They promised job growth, and at a meeting with the president recently, he said he didn't understand why we couldn't have job growth of 4, 5, or 6%. I don't know an economist who thinks we're going to have 6% economic growth, but they use that as the linchpin, the excuse for a tax cut that's going to add $1 trillion to the budget deficits. All based on the following economic assumption: maybe. Maybe we'll have growth that will help us to pay down the debt. All the mainstream economists say maybe a return of 1/3 on the tax cuts in terms of revenue. Joint tax, the Wharton School, the Tax Policy Center, Moody's.com, they all say the same thing. None of this is going to happen. So we're also back to a familiar argument that they hear, and I hope we can pay some attention to this for the moment. They will say things repeatedly like, it's the people's money. The people know what to do with it. Well, let me say this as well tonight. It's the people's veterans' hospitals. 1 million new veterans after Iraq and Afghanistan who are going to be in need of long-term care. That's the people's responsibility. In addition, 10,000 baby boomers retire every single day in America. Social Security is part of their retirement system, even as it averages about $15,000 for American citizens. We're going to live longer, and we herald that achievement regularly, but it's also going to mean more Alzheimer's and more dementia that families are going to have to reconcile. And they're going to come back and say at the right moment, oh, because there's less revenue, we're going to have cuts in social spending. So they're going to say at the right moment, oh, we're going to have to now change the way we calculate Medicare and Social Security. This is a missed opportunity above everything else. Everybody agrees on what's wrong with the tax code. I yield myself an additional 1 minute, Mr. Speaker.
Chairman is recognized for an additional minute.
There was a chance here to do some investment in human capital. Community colleges, vocational education, internship programs. The Labor Department reported 3 weeks ago 6 million jobs go unanswered in America every single day. And I hope tonight, as the Republicans confer, they can tell us where they're actually conferring, because between the paste and the bubble gum, they keep putting on a new dimension to their proposal. This should be a debate that included both parties. So I want, just before I yield back my time for the moment, I want to say this. We had a chance to really do something big. They have unbelievably proposed to take the entire revenue architecture of this country in 3 weeks without one hearing, without one witness. They're going to change it all. And the middle class is about to get it in the neck to take care of people at the top. And with that, I reserve the balance of my time.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The House will be in order. The House will be in order. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I yield myself as much time as I may use.
The gentleman is recognized.
I rise in strong opposition to the motion to instruct. Today, we're moving to the crucial final stage in delivering once-in-a-generation tax reform to the American people. The choice we face now is clear. Do we want to stick with this complex, costly, unfair system that today caters to special interests and drives American jobs overseas? Do we want to stick with the slow-growth tax code that keeps our economy in second gear and all but guarantees rising debt and deficits? Or do we think it's time to go in a new direction? Do we think it's finally time to provide our workers, our families, and our job creators with a tax code that is simple, that's fair, that's built to create jobs and leapfrog America back into the lead pack around the world? Do we think it's time to get our economy growing again? And I mean truly growing, where better jobs, bigger paychecks, and more opportunities are available to people throughout this country. Many in Washington say they support tax reform, yet every argument we hear is about keeping taxes high, keeping the growth of jobs and paychecks low, and keeping more of this broken tax code that is so complex and so unfair to everyday Americans. It also almost seems too many in Congress are rooting against a growing and prosperous American economy. Too many who claim to be concerned about the deficit today joyfully added trillions of dollars to the national deficit when it meant Washington could spend more. When our friends on the other side took control of the House in the first year, they doubled the deficit. In the second year, tripled the deficit. And then went on a roll of $1 trillion of more in debt every year. In fact, they voted for a $1 trillion stimulus absolutely unpaid for that did nothing to grow the economy. That was when Washington could spend. But now, when it comes to letting families in our Main Street businesses spend more of their own hard-earned money, all of a sudden they say no. Come on, man. If you ask my constituents in Texas, they'll tell you, without a doubt, it's time to go in a new direction. It's time to be pro-growth. It's time to leave this slow-growth status quo behind us for good. Without a doubt, my constituents and so many Americans throughout our country are rooting for a healthier, stronger economy and a simpler, fair tax code that allows them to keep more of their own hard-earned money. That's why right now it's time for us to come together in a conference committee and finalize the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act for the American people. When the Ways and Means Committee started working on tax reform over 6 years ago, we knew this road would be long and difficult. We've had our shares and ups and downs along the way, but we stuck with it because we knew the American people were counting on us. And we know they're counting on us now. So with this conference committee, we're going to come together to give the American people the best of what our two bills have to offer. At every step, we're going to ask ourselves, how can we truly deliver the tax code Americans deserve? How do we drive rates lower for families? How do we encourage more investment and job creation on Main Street? How do we bring jobs back to America from overseas? How can we better support parents and students and homeowners and retirees? How can we make our economy stronger and healthier than ever? How do we improve lives across our country? We've all worked hard to get to this point in the process. I'm proud of the bill we've delivered in the House, and I want to congratulate the Senate as well. Right now, we're closer than ever to delivering on our tax reform promise to the American people. But some of our most important work is still ahead of us. Now's the time for us to dig deep on behalf of the people we were sent here to serve. Now's the time for us to come together in a conference committee and unite behind one historic tax cut bill that will help Americans of all walks of life. This truly is the moment and the opportunity that we and so many Americans have worked for and waited for and deserve. Now's the time to seize it, and working truly together, I'm confident we will. With that, I urge my colleagues to oppose this motion to instruct that kills tax reform, and I reserve the balance of my time.
Jim reserves the balance of his time. The House will be in order. House will be in order. House will be in order. The gentleman from Massachusetts.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With that, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Michigan who announced this past weekend that he is going to leave this institution, and he has served this institution with distinction and grace for a long period of time. Mr. Levin, for 1 minute.
The gentleman from Michigan is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you so much for yielding. You know, the chairman of the committee says, come together. You have done it alone, and you have snubbed your nose at the American people as well as the process of this institution. The GOP tax bill combines the Republicans' long-term faith in trickle-down economics with a new brazen disregard for the facts that has become the hallmark of the Trump presidency. This bill is mostly about cutting taxes for the very wealthy, not the middle class. Making the very wealthy even richer is not the path to broad-based economic prosperity and growth. And tax cuts for the very top do not pay for themselves. Instead, they increase the debt. These are the facts that have been presented by Joint Tax, and so many others have called the Republican bill a boondoggle and delusional. Republicans say the facts be damned, as they rush this legislation out of desperation, not deliberation. I yield back.
This is recognized.
Speaker, I'd point out that a family of 4 in Michigan's 9th District will save over $1,700 each and every year. With that, I'm proud to yield 3 minutes to the chairman of the Tax Policy Subcommittee and a leader on the tax reform effort, the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Roskin.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Thank you, Chairman Brady. I want to just direct the membership's attention to an argument that the ranking member made a couple of minutes ago where he criticized repatriation efforts in the past. And he's right. They underperformed. Why did they underperform? Because they were a holiday. Because it was temporary. So we've learned from that. I wasn't around when that happened, but we've learned from that, Mr. Speaker, and we're saying, let's not do that again. And said, let's have a permanent policy that unlocks American dollars that are locked out overseas right now. Most folks think it's between $3 and $4 trillion that can come back home. And where does that come back home? I'm telling you, It'll come to the 6th Congressional District of Illinois. It'll go to Massachusetts. It'll go to Texas. It'll go to all of these places to be reinvested. Why? Because this is a dynamic, vibrant economy that can become better. This is an attractive place. We just need to make it better. The other argument that he made was essentially, look, is this really going to create growth? And he's right to point out that not all tax cuts are created equal as it relates to growth. The whole purpose, though, is not simply growth, it's also tax relief. I've got a constituency that got jammed by Democrats in the Illinois General Assembly this year with a massive tax hike on the middle income folks in Illinois. They need relief. So part of this is to offer relief. Now, the way that we've approached this is to say, let's create this as it relates to the investment and expensing. You look at the Tax Foundation, nonpartisan work that they've done, and they'll tell you that investment that we're making, that is throwing away depreciation schedules and telling small businesses, if you invest, you can write it all off on year one, that creates activity. So we ought to shed and shun this motion to instruct, and instead, let's work through the normal conference process. And Mr. Speaker, in closing, let me give you one quick anecdote, and it's this. A manufacturer in my district told me this, that they are currently planning under their approach to invest $30 million in their manufacturing plant. Next year, if we do this bill, they're not going to invest $30 million in that facility. They're going to invest $50 million. That's one company in one cul-de-sac in one subdivision in suburban Chicago. You ripple that out throughout the entire economy, great things happened. Vote no on the motion, and let's proceed to conference.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With that, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Texas, a valued member of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Doggett.
Gentleman from Texas recognized for 1 minute.
More than a bill, this is a lie wrapped in lies. A sneak attack on America, ramming through here at warp speed before the truth catches up with the lies. A very thin sugar coating of tax changes for some in the middle class conceals massive special interest giveaways. But I'm convinced that the reckoning will come. Americans will demand accountability of a scheme that showers its benefits overwhelmingly on corporations and those at the top of the economic ladder, including the Trump family personally benefiting. The reckoning will come when students and the sick find out they're paying not less taxes, but more taxes under this bill. The reckoning will come as Republicans use the huge debt burden that they are deliberately creating by this bill as an excuse to cut Medicare, educational opportunities, and other vital investments. And this sham of a bill provides rewards to corporate tax dodgers and creates a giant new loophole. A giant new loophole for outsourcing American jobs abroad. The only coming together here is the coming together between the master of distraction, the big tweet down the street, who's joined here by the masters of deceit in Congress. They ignore any wrong he commits. He can embrace a child molester. He can attack our law enforcement officers. He can challenge the very basis of the free press in our country, use any means necessary, whatever deception, to try to foist off this sham of a bill on America. It should be rejected.
Members are reminded to refrain from engaging. The House will be in order. Members are reminded to refrain from engaging in personalities towards the President. The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you.
The gentleman is not recognized. The gentleman is out of order.
Regular order. Regular order.
The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would note that the average family of four making $59,000 a year, the 35th District of Texas, will see a tax cut of over $1,100. I'm proud to yield 3 minutes to the gentleman from New York, a key leader of the Ways and Means Committee, who knows what it's like to create jobs in New York. Gentleman from New York, Mr. Reed.
Gentleman from New York is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And thank you to Chairman Brady for the time to speak tonight. And before I get into my speech this evening, I just want to take a moment I just heard a colleague on the other side of the aisle call essentially me a master of deceit. This country is sick and tired of this type of divisive rhetoric. I am here to tell you that it is time to put the American people first. I understand that we sit sometimes in this chamber on the biggest political theater in the United States of America, but at some point in time, I got to say, enough is enough. To my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, I would ask us, and to the American people back home, look at the legislation that we have done on the committee. Bottom line, hard-working taxpayers in my district are going to see $1,600 of their hard-earned dollars remain in their pocket with the government not taking that money away from them in the House bill. There are differences between the House bill and the Senate bill. I think there are legitimate parts of the Senate bill we should consider in this conference committee that we are going to entertain here very shortly. Things like the medical expense deduction, things potentially like the historic tax credit. But that is how legislation is drafted. We have a body in the Senate, we have a body in the House, and we come together to put the best product forward for the American people. And I will tell you, as I have heard from my colleagues on the other side of the aisle, if reducing taxes is not a part of economic growth, then you disagree with every governor in the United States of America. Because every governor's economic development plan across this state, what does it do? You see the commercials as you travel around this country. Come to New York State. We're open for business because we have lowered our taxes for opportunities and growth. I see it in Illinois. I see it in California. I see it in Texas. So what we have done with the proposal in the House is exactly that. We have focused relief on hardworking taxpayers, and we have lowered the tax burden overall so that people can invest in their businesses, they can invest in their families, and they can grow the economy, which at the end of the day, you know what that means for an American person? That means more money for them, but most importantly, it means a job. A job not only to make money, but it's good for the soul. It's good for the heart. It brings you pride in knowing that you did an honest day's work to get an honest day's amount of pay. That's what growth is about. It's not about numbers. It's about people and opportunity. I ask my colleagues, join us in rejecting this motion to instruct, and let's get to the business of the people and finish the job.
Gentleman's time has expired.
Once
The
and
gentleman
for
from
all.
Texas reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. With that, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from California, a valued member of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Thompson.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
Mr. Speaker, I rise in support of this motion. The underlying bill raises taxes on millions of middle-class working Americans. It adds over $2.3 trillion to our national debt, and if the Senate has its way, 13 million people will lose their health care. This bill was written behind closed doors by a handful of Republicans to give massive permanent tax breaks to corporations at the cost of our middle-class working Americans. Not one legislative hearing was held in the House on this bill. The Senate bill was passed in the dark hours of the night with scribbles in the margin. Every single person in our country should know how their member of Congress voted on this, because you and your children will be paying for it for decades to come. This is a bad bill. I hope this will be a serious conference to improve this reckless piece of legislation. I yield back the balance of my
Gentleman yields
time.
back. The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I would point out that the average family of four in the 5th District of California will see a tax cut of over $2,370. With that, I'm proud to yield 4 minutes to, again, a key leader of tax reform who's got this terrific accounting, tax, and business background, gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Rice.
Gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 4 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The American dream, it's what separates us from the rest of the world. It promises that with hard work and determination, you can improve your station in life and that your children have the opportunity for a better life than yours. But for many in the generation coming of age in the past decade, the American dream has been a little tarnished, just out of reach. The last time we did tax reform was 30 years ago. At that time, we were the world's uncontested economic leader. Our economic system and tax code were competitive. But for decades, we have sat idly as the world restructured to pass us by. As we became less competitive, more and more American companies and American jobs left our shores. And what has been the result? We've lost millions of middle-class jobs. In 1990, the middle class comprised 50% of American families. Today, only 40%. And today, the middle class makes just about the same take-home pay as they did in 1990, 27 years later. When we all worry about income disparity and the gulf between the rich and the poor in this country, this is the source of the problem. The American middle class is smaller and has not had a raise in 30 years. How could this happen? It has everything to do with this bloated, over-regulating and overtaxing federal government, a government that sucks the life out of the economy and forces our companies, our innovators, and our job creators out of the country to survive. Some folks say it doesn't matter that we have the highest business tax rate in the world. That's not why companies left. They say those jobs aren't coming back. Well, I say the outdated tax code is an anchor around the neck of American business, our innovators, and our American middle class. I say the American worker can compete with anyone on a level playing field if we just get government out of the way. Since January, we've been working to correct that. We've made dramatic steps in reducing regulation, and you're already seeing the economic lift. Today, we continue to advance a tax cut which will restore economic growth, put more take-home pay into the pockets of hard-working Americans, and restore opportunity for a generation. It will bring American jobs back to America, which will grow our middle class, and finally, after 30 years, give the middle class the pay raise it deserves. If you really wish to grow the economy, you should support this tax reform package. If you really wish to give the middle class a raise, you should support tax reform. If you really wish to reduce income disparity, you should support this tax reform package. If you really wish to give hope to Americans who have given up and left the workforce and reduce crime and addiction in this country, you should support this tax reform package. And if you want America to have the economic strength to remain a force of peace and stability in the world, you should support this tax reform package. Finally, if you support the American dream, you should support this tax reform package. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back to the gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, with that, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from Connecticut, neighbor and good friend, Congressman Larson.
The gentleman from Connecticut is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I seek unanimous consent to submit for the record a notice from the comptroller, both the comptroller and the Commissioner of Revenue Services for the state of Connecticut, who notes that a married family with a kid in college would see a $767 tax increase next year and a $1,667 increase in the year 2027. Look, we've already protested what we think about this bill, what you've done to this process, the stain that this is on this institution. 1986 has been cited, no public hearings. We had 30 hearings, 12 subcommittee hearings, 456 witnesses. We have none. And now you do a bill in double secret probation. You make Dean Warmer look good from Animal House. This is what's wrong with this process here today. And the cruelest cut is that you perpetrate a $25 billion cut in Medicare that you don't even have to vote on. That is the worst cut. Talk about a cowardly act in the night. $25 billion cut to our seniors. No wonder the AARP has spoken out so strongly against it.
The gentleman's time has expired. All members are reminded that they should address their remarks to the chair. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to remind the House that family of 4 in Connecticut's 1st District will see a tax cut of $3,858 each and every year. I'm proud to yield 3 minutes to a new member and a key member of the Ways and Means Committee, gentleman from Arizona, Mr. Schweikert.
The gentleman from Arizona is recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I start, what I wanted to share, look, I've been blessed to be on the Ways and Means Committee now for, 11 months. I have found the members on the left, the right. It's a group of folks with pretty high IQs. It's a smart bunch. Yeah, we have different views, even within our own, within your own. But it's fascinating. It's joyful to be on a committee where when you do argue with each other, particularly when we have conversations in the back, they happen at a fairly high level. But can I give you sort of a personal global view of how I'm viewing this tax reform? And I truly believe this will be the single biggest, most important vote I make in my life. We all know what status quo is. Status quo on many of the models basically says in about 15, 18 years, we hit a debt crisis. Are we arguing here for status quo or our change? Or are we having an argument here that you don't like our changes, but you also agree we need to have a revolution in our economic growth? If we build our lives as it is set right now with a 1.8, 1.9% GDP growth for the next 3 decades, my 2-year-old's future is miserable. Those very seniors that someone was just speaking about, do you understand what happens to those earned entitlements? Because there is no money. We hit a debt crisis. We are just a few years away from publicly held debt equaling the size of our entire economy. If you love people, if you care about this country keeping its promises, we got to grow. We've seen the attempts at sort of managed economy, managed control, managed targeted. How about something much more elegant? Let's make us competitive in the world again. Let's get rid of all the lobbyist-created little special deals in the tax code, or as many as we can politically, and do everything we can to get this economy growing. And yes, it's going to require more, in my view of the world, than tax reform. It's going to require, we're going to have to deal with immigration. We're going to have to deal with technology. We're going to have to deal with regulation. But we all know around here that if we do not have a revolution in this tax code, our future is pretty dark. With economic growth, our future is actually really bright. And when you see the Atlanta Fed telling us just in anticipation of tax reform, we have crossed 3.5% GDP growth right now, maybe that 1.8% misery of economic growth isn't our future, isn't the future for my little girl, isn't the future for every American, but it's an opportunity for this country to start looking like, as it should, a land of opportunity. And with that, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Oregon, Congressman Blumenauer, a particular champion of all renewable energy forms.
The gentleman from Oregon is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I listened to my friend from Arizona, and I wonder what planet he's on. He's concerned about his little 2-year-old, and yet they finance the largest transfer of wealth in our nation's history by adding more debt on the backs of his children, our grandchildren, and generations to come. They want the public to have more of their money, yet they're not supporting our motion to recommit that would stop this notion that we are going to jack up premium prices 10% a year by destabilizing the insurance markets. That the notion here that these ugly surprises that the lobbyists have snuck in, and we'll find out about them every single week going forward. Reject this misguided approach. Let's work together. Rebuild and renew America. You know, the states can raise a gas tax. We refuse to acknowledge a straightforward proposition to do that here. Let's reject this atrocity.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I would note that a family of 4 in Oregon's 3rd District will see tax savings of $2,256 a year. With that, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to yield 1 minute to the distinguished gentleman from New Jersey, again, a very important member of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Pascrell.
The gentleman from New Jersey is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. You know, the President himself will see a financial windfall, Mr. Speaker. And if the majority wasn't helping him hide his tax returns, the American people could see the truth. The bill exacerbates dramatic and historic wealth inequality, adding $1.5 trillion to our national debt, as this bill does, without benefiting the middle and working class, is legislative malpractice. So while Republicans tout this as a middle-class tax cut, some taxpayers at every income level will pay more on this bill. A middle-aged married couple with no children earning $80,900 a year who itemized could end up paying $4,330 more in 2018. Many of my constituents will see a big tax increase after losing the full state and local tax deduction. That is absurd. In fact, the authors of this bill said all of the individual tax cuts will expire after 2025, as well as change the measure of inflation, which will slowly bump taxpayers into higher income brackets. Are we kidding, and who are we kidding?
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That family of 4 in New Jersey's 9th District making $90,000 a year, 2 workers will see a tax cut of $2,044. I reserve my balance.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And I want to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New York, a member of the leadership of the Democratic Party, and also I think he's going to tell us about what the elimination of the state and local tax deduction means to the people of New York.
The gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Gentlemen. I just want to point out to my colleague and friend from Texas that the statistics he's talking about are temporary as they're applied to personal income tax, but they're permanent for corporations. All of your tax cuts are permanent for corporate world, but not for individuals. And he talks about a family of 4. Take it for $1,100 a year. Divided by 4, it's $250. They're going to borrow $1.5 trillion. Divided by 300 million, that's $5,000 per American. Do the math. You're suspending the future of our country to give the biggest tax cut to corporations and the wealthiest, $4 billion alone to the Trump family. And you do this on the backs by double taxation in places like Pennsylvania, like New York, California, and New Jersey, where you're double taxing through the SALT provision, state and local taxes. This is going to have an incredible impact on the lives of your constituents. How anyone with a conscience on the Republican side of the aisle who could support this bill in California, New York, Pennsylvania, Illinois, and all the other tax states in this country, it's unconscionable.
The gentleman's time has expired. Members are reminded that they should direct their remarks to the chair. The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm pleased to report that median family of 4 in New York's 14th District, making $63,000 a year, working hard, will see a tax cut of $1,251. I reserve the balance.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman is out of order. The gentleman is out of order. The gentleman is out of order. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from Illinois, a valued member of the Ways and Means Committee, Mr. Davis, who is also a great champion of new markets tax credits and the historic tax credit, which is eliminated in the Republican tax plan.
The gentleman from Illinois is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In every place that I went yesterday, people ask me, what are you going to say to the conferees? And I say I'm going to join with my colleagues and say to the conferees, help the needy and not the greedy. I'm going to say to the conferees, why give 50% of the tax break to the wealthiest 1% of the population in this country? I'm going to say, why cut Medicare, Medicaid, and provisions of the Affordable Care Act that have kept millions of people from having the agony, pain, and frustration of not being able to find health care? I'm going to say, save the children, save the veterans, save the central cities that are decayed, save the infrastructure, save the safety net, and save America. I yield back.
Yields back. The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm proud to report that that family of 4 with 2 kids median in the 7th District of Illinois making $73,000, really working hard where every dollar counts, will see a tax cut of $1,546. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentleman from New York, a valued member of the Ways and Means Committee, Congressman Higgins, for 1 minute.
The gentleman from New York is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. It's been said by the U.S. Treasury Secretary the tax cuts pay for themselves. And he says not only will these corporate tax pay for themselves, they will add an additional $2 trillion in economic activity. Nobody believes that. There is no credible report that supports that contention. What does pay for itself are tax credits, particularly the federal historic tax credit. It's one that returns generously to the federal treasury. The federal historic tax credit returns more to the treasury than it costs. In fact, $25 billion in credits have returned $29 billion to the federal treasury. $5 of private investment is made for every dollar in the federal historic tax credit program. Nationally, $132 billion in private investment has been made because of $25 million in federal historic tax credits. Over 43,000 buildings in downtown areas like my community of Buffalo, New York, have benefited tremendously from this valuable program. It's eliminated in the House bill, it's eliminated in the Senate bill, and the conference should restore it as an issue of fairness. And
the gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm proud to report that median family of 4 making $74,000, blue-collar workers, the 26th District of New York, will see a tax cut of $1,562. I reserve.
The gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, a great champion of the middle class is the gentlelady from Alabama, Congressman Sewell, a Marshall Scholar, and I recognize her for 1 minute.
The gentlewoman from Alabama is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, we are not ready for conference. The Senate bill was written by lobbyists in the dead of the night when Republicans hoped no one was paying attention. No CBO score, no debate, no time to even read the bill. And now the majority thinks the bill is ready to go to conference. Really? Not. The House and the Senate bills will put us at least $1.4 trillion into debt, will cause us to cut Social Security and Medicare, and raise taxes on 82 million Americans. Mr. Speaker, this is a bad deal for Americans, and it's an even worse deal for my constituents in Alabama. In my state of Alabama, over 500,000 families making $80,000 a year or less will see a tax increase. It will result in $205 million being taken away from teachers and students, and it will put $168 million in charitable donations at risk. These bills are not for the middle class. These bills will do enormous damage to the middle class. Mr. Speaker, we are not ready for conference.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I would point out a median family of 4 making $65,000 in Alabama's 7th District would see a tax cut of $1,311. I would also point out that the Congressional Budget Office doesn't score tax reform bills. That's the Joint Committee on Taxation. That score was available to Ways and Means members the day we voted on this bill, and available again to House members before we approved it as well. I yield back.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 1 minute to the well-regarded gentlelady from Washington, Congresswoman Del Bene.
The gentleman from Washington is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the past few weeks, Republicans have been cutting backroom deals that benefit the wealthy and well-connected out of the light of day, piling hurt onto people who won't be able to speak for themselves. Now we're on the verge of being force-fed a bill in which corporations get massive tax cuts while hard-working Americans are forced to pick up the tab. Over the life of the Ryan McConnell plan, 36 million middle-class families struggling to pay for health care, education, child care, housing, and retirement are going to see their taxes go up. And now, millions may lose health care coverage as well. What happened to fiscal responsibility? Economists are telling us the increased debt won't be paid for by economic growth, and CEOs are openly sharing their plans to reward their shareholders with their new tax breaks, not create jobs. This bill is reckless. I urge my colleagues to support the motion, and I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I would point out that a median family of 4 with 2 kids in Washington's 1st District will see a tax cut of $5,008. I'd also remind my colleagues that President Obama raised the national debt by $9 trillion in new Washington spending. I reserve.
The gentleman reserves the balance of his time. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And I'd like to yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from California, again, a distinguished member of the Ways and Means Committee, Congresswoman Sanchez.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I rise today to ask a simple question. What is the rush? Why are we rushing to vote on a $1.7 trillion tax bill that will end up being paid off the backs of working Americans? And don't be fooled, working Americans will pay for this bill. That's why the National Association of Realtors warned that the typical homeowner in my state could see their home value drop between $37,000 and $57,000. That's why the Joint Committee on Taxation has said the Republican bill would increase costs to college students and their families by $71 billion. And we all know whose retirement Republicans will raid when their overly optimistic growth numbers don't materialize. They're going to come after your Medicare and Social Security. The American people deserve better than this Republican tax scam. And instead of rushing to get this done, let's work together to get it done right. Thank you, and I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd point out that hardworking family of 4 in California's 38th District would see a tax cut of $1,870. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, let me yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from California, the former Revenue Commissioner of California, who knows something about revenue projections. For 1 minute, Congresswoman Chu.
The gentleman from California is recognized for 1 minute.
This tax scam is one of the greatest cons I've seen in my time in Congress, and Republicans know it. Why else would they rush to vote without giving the public time to review or understand legislation that impacts 100% of our economy? In the Senate, they even shattered regular order to pass this bill with handwritten, illegible changes in the dead of night on Saturday. Perhaps it's because they don't want anybody to see how far this bill strays from their promises. They promised historic tax cuts, but unless you are already rich or a corporation already seeing record profits, you're unlikely to benefit. Instead, you and your children will be paying to make the rich richer. Republicans don't even deny that individuals get less than corporations, but it's okay, they claim, because that money will get to you eventually, and they keep on citing these magical numbers of money that you'll get. But we know these dollars won't come, whether losing deductions for state and local taxes, paying more for student loans, or facing higher health care prices. Thanks to the repeal of the mandate, the GOP tax scam will hurt millions.
Gentlewoman's time has expired. The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd point out that hardworking family for 27th District of California will see a tax cut of $2,249. I'm proud to yield 2 minutes to a key member of our tax policy subcommittee and a business person himself, the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Kelly.
The gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Chairman, thank you so much. I wasn't going to speak tonight because I was just trying to figure out what it is that we were trying to get to here. And if it's always going to be the same thing as if it's not our bill, just not the bill we want. And when we talk about a rush to judgment, a rush to judgment. For 31 years, we have postponed the inevitable. We no longer can compete globally because of our corporate tax rates and the regulations. Our people, and I don't care if they're Republican voters or Democrat voters or people that don't vote at all, isn't it time to give them a little bit more money in their take-home pay? Isn't it time to let them get up in the morning with an idea that I can actually be better at the end of the day than I started? And isn't it time for us to talk about bringing millions of jobs back to the United States as opposed to sitting here and trying to battle back and forth about something that is a political, it doesn't make any sense. And for the folks that are sitting at home, do you realize how far we're getting away from what we pledged would do for them? A dynamic and robust economy that allows for more take-home pay. A dynamic and robust economy that allows corporations to flourish and not flounder. A tax plan that absolutely puts America back where it so deservedly belongs. With all the assets that we are blessed with all the talent that we are blessed with all the opportunity that we are blessed with, can we really think that tonight's the night to turn this into a political battle, to make one side look good, one side look bad? Is it always going to be the war on the wealthy? Is it always going to be the war on some entity? Does it have to be some type of an identity before we can actually back away and say, tonight we are going to do something for every single hardworking American? And please, refrain from using the term middle class. There's nothing, I think, that flies more in the face of who we aren't as a society than classifying people, oh, they're middle class, oh, they're upper class, which leads to me to believe there must be a lower class. I am asking tonight, not for either side of the aisle, but for America to look at what's going on and say it's not time for us to get back in the game.
The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman's time has expired. The gentleman from Texas reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'd like to yield 2 minutes to the distinguished gentleman from South Carolina, the Assistant Democratic Leader. And in reference to my friend, Mr. Kelly, Mr. Clyburn, a real champion of the middle class. For 2 minutes.
The gentleman from South Carolina is recognized for 2 minutes.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much for yielding me this time. Let me say to the gentleman from, I think, Pennsylvania, it is time to do all of those things that he just spoke about. But this piece of legislation does none of those things. In fact, it raises taxes on 87 million middle-income families, cut $25 billion a year from Medicare, kick 13 million people off of their health insurance, make it easier for companies to ship jobs overseas, eliminate long-held deductions for teachers, students, and the chronically ill, make individual tax cuts temporary, but corporate tax cuts permanent, and increase the deficit by more than $1.5 trillion. The hypocrisy of so-called conservatives is staggering. Corporations will save billions, and shareholders will get richer while our children and grandchildren foot the bill. The Democratic motion would instruct conferees to protect deductions for state and local taxes and restore the American Care Act's individual mandate. Doing so would stop 13 million Americans from losing their health insurance and put a halt to the 10% premium hike that CBO estimates the Ryan McConnell tax scam would cause. Mr. Speaker, the individual mandate is at the heart of the Affordable Care Act. Repealing it, as the GOP tax scam does, is a deliberate attempt to undercut the law, create chaos in the health insurance marketplaces, increase premiums, and decrease choice and coverage. I urge my colleagues to restore state and local tax deductibility and the individual mandate, and I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Yes, Mr. Speaker, I point out that middle-class family making $74,000, the 5th District of South Carolina, will see a tax cut of $1,568. I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to yield 4 minutes to the gentleman from Maryland, one of the best legislators in the House, the Democratic whip, Mr. Hoyer.
The gentleman from Maryland is recognized for 4 minutes.
I thank Mr. Neal for yielding. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, as he well knows, is one of my favorite members. He is a good friend. He is a man of great integrity. But, Mr. Speaker, both the House and Senate bills are bad bills. And this is a sad day in the House. Hypocrisy is on stark display. Responsibility is absent, and politics and donors have subverted policy. This conference is a sham, an attempt to make it appear that the House and Senate are going through regular order. Sadly, we have not gone through regular order. The thought is we will reconcile the two versions of the dangerous Republican tax increase and deficit bill. I call this a debt tax because it will explode the deficit. As happened in 1981, when under Ronald Reagan for 8 years we increased the debt of this country 189%. The chairman of the Ways and Means Committee mentions Mr. Obama, who increased it 88%, or less than half of the Reagan increase in the debt. And we were promised then, as we're promised now, that cutting these taxes would grow the economy. Would that that were the case. But there won't be any real regular order in this conference, just as there hasn't been throughout this entire process. There will only be further closed door, backroom antics by leaders on their own, asking Republican members to take it or leave it. And this motion to instruct, of course, will be defeated. But Democrats are offering it because from the very beginning, we have made clear that we are here to work toward the kind of tax reform that the American people want. Tax reform that I worked with in 1986. And they don't want an elimination of the deduction for state and local taxes, which our motion would instruct the conferees not to do. The deductions for state and local taxes support schools and first responders in our communities. And the American people don't want to kick 13 million people off their health insurance coverage. So our motion would instruct conferees, take this dangerous provision out. But no motion to instruct can address all the ways the Republican tax bills put our people and our future in danger. The Senate bill raises taxes on somewhere around 78 million working Americans, middle-class households, not as a pejorative, but as an income spectrum. Why? To offset massive tax cuts for those not with whom we're at war, but who are doing very well and don't need our help. It plunges our children and grandchildren, of which I have a number, an additional $1.7 trillion in debt, and I think that's the minimum, making them pay tomorrow for what Republicans refuse to pay for today. And for what? For what, Mr. Speaker, are we being asked to do all these things? For economic growth? For jobs? We know it won't grow our economy in any substantially way faster. Why? Because almost every economist tells us that. And we know that the few jobs the Senate bill would create, and listen to this, that they claim that they'll create will cost $1.9 million per job. The vast majority of Americans won't benefit from this plan, but those who are already extremely wealthy will benefit greatly. As a matter of fact, 52 times what the gentleman will tell us.
Yield an additional 1 minute.
I thank the gentleman recognized for an additional minute.
Mr. Speaker, there's a saying that Texans like to use, this dog won't hunt. It doesn't do what it's purported to do. It doesn't take Einstein to predict what will happen this time around, when he said doing the same thing over and over and expecting a different result is insanity. I've been here. I've seen this. I've heard this argument. It has always resulted in the same thing. Now, I have more to say, but my time is up. And let me say to the gentleman from Texas, the chairman of the committee, he's going to tell me how much people in my district get a tax break. Tell me about my children and my grandchildren whose debts you will pile on them to borrow money from China or someplace else to give this tax cut that they will then have to pay off in their time. Tell me how much my children will have their taxes raised, Mr. Chairman, and I yield to him. He apparently doesn't know. That's sad. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The House will be in order. The House will be in order. Gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. Gentleman from Texas.
Thanks, Mr. Speaker. I'll yield myself 1 minute.
Gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
So I'm proud to report that hardworking families, that median hardworking middle-class family in the 5th District of Maryland, will see a tax cut of $4,158. And I would, not at this time. So I will remind everyone here tonight, the first year our Democrats took over the majority House, they doubled the deficit. The second year, they tripled the deficit. In the third year, it went above $1 trillion a year. And it stayed there until Republicans took control of the House. And $9 trillion, my friends across the aisle added to this deficit. But that was when Washington was spending. Today, we want to give people back control of their money, and all of a sudden, whoa, wait a minute, deficits suddenly matter? I believe that claim is the hypocrisy in this debate. With that, I reserve.
Gentleman reserves. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized. The House will be in order. The House will be in order. The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Apparently the gentleman forgets the difference between the Clinton years and the Bush years as it relates to the deficits. And with that, I'd like to yield to the gentlelady from California, very distinguished leader and capable legislator, Congresswoman Pelosi.
For how much time is he yielding to the gentlewoman?
A long 1 minute.
The gentleman is recognized for 1 minute.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I thank the gentleman for yielding, and I thank him and the Democratic members of the Ways and Means Committee for being committed to the truth, to the facts. And to hear the distinguished chairman of the committee say what he said about the budget is almost ludicrous, almost laughable, if it weren't so serious in terms of the impact that it has on America's future. He knows that in the last 4 and maybe even 5 years of the Clinton administration, the budget was in balance or in surplus, the operational budget, and was on a path to reducing the national debt until President Bush came in, gave tax cuts to the high end, a giveaway to the pharmaceutical industry with the Medicare Part D legislation, and 3 unpaid for wars. That is what the experts will tell you increased the deficit that was on a path of the national debt of going down. It was a swing, my colleagues, of $11 trillion. To date, the biggest swing in history. When President Obama came into office, he was inheriting a deficit. I'm not talking about the national debt. I'm just talking about the annual deficit of $1.4 billion. $1.4 billion. When he left, it was about a third of that. When the Republicans came, when he left office. So don't try to mislead the American people. We owe them the truth. We owe them facts. And that's why what is happening tonight in this body is so important. That the violence that the Republicans are doing with their legislation on the economy of our country, robbing from our children's futures to reward the wealthiest people and biggest corporations in America. Who? I rise tonight to ask my colleagues a simple, who do we represent when we come to this floor? The American people overwhelmingly oppose the GOP tax scam. They see it as that, and they are making their voices heard. The American people are calling the Republican Congress to abandon the House and Senate bills which pillage the middle class and pad the pockets of GOP, of big CEOs and GOP donors. The American people want us to start over and actually put the middle class first. We should be working in a bipartisan way in order to do that, so that it will not only be right, but that it will be sustainable, that there'll be some certainty in our economy that this is a path forward that has bipartisan support. But has the People's House, the Republicans in the People's House, listened to the American people? No. Last month, House Republicans voted to raise taxes. In this House, House Republicans voted to raise taxes on 36 million middle-class American families, stripping deductions from students and teachers, children and seniors, homeowners and workers. Last week, in the dead of night, Senate Republicans, and they kept saying, the Senate is going to work it out in the Senate with the Senate. Okay, last week in the dead of night, Senate Republicans voted to raise taxes on 78 million middle-class families, while also spiking health premiums and exploding the ranks of the health uninsured. Tonight, heading into this conference on the House and Senate bills, Republicans have sent an unmistakable message to the middle class America. Pick your poison, because with either bill, middle-class families lose. American people lose. According to an analysis of the Washington Post, the GOP tax scam is, quote, probably the most regressive tax cut in the past 50 years. It's hard to find a tax plan that has done less for the middle class. That's what we talked about. Who? Who are we here to represent? Why? Why are they doing this? Well, they're doing this to give a tax cut to the top 1%. The Senate bill is 62% of the benefits of the bill go to the top 1% in our country. Is that fair? To give over nearly $1.5 trillion in tax cuts to corporate America, while heaping other benefits on them to make it easier for them to send jobs overseas. Why? Well, some of their people have told us why. Chris Collins said, my donors were basically saying, get it done or don't ever call me again. Senator Lindsey Graham has said the financial contributions will stop if the tax bill scam fails. The scam is my word, added word. The director of National Economic Council, Gary Cohen, has said the most excited group out there are the big CEOs, corporate CEOs of our tax plan, he said. This is interesting to see the Freedom Caucus, which I thought was a values-based caucus committed to reducing the national debt. A debt that is being added to here that we may never recover from. What happened to the Freedom Caucus? Weren't they supposed to be deficit hawks? Has that become an endangered species? No, it's become extinct. Extinct. It does not exist on the Republican side, but it does exist on the Democratic side. And we intend to fight this robbing of the future by increasing the deficit into the trillions of dollars by fighting this bill to the end. Where are all the Republicans who promised to reduce the deficit? Where our Republican colleagues insist that we have no funds. We have no funds to spare for the health care of our children, the education of our young people, the job-creating infrastructure of the 21st century, unless we find offsets. And yet, $1.5 trillion to corporate America, unoffset. Tax cuts for the wealthiest people in our country, unoffset. That means children have to pay for their health care with their immunizations. It's absolutely appalling. It isn't a statement of values in any way. Today, quietly, the Republicans, and some of them are admitting it with glee, they are sharpening their knives for Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security, recognizing how they are increasing, they are soaring the national debt. Now they have to find some ways to pay for it, so they're coming after Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security. The understanding of some is that it's only a question of whether they do it this year or following year after the election. Well, I think you're in a lose-lose situation. I think you lose with your donors if you don't pass this bill, but you're going to lose with the American people if you do. Democrats believe that people deserve better. We deserve bipartisanship in how we put this together so it's sustainable. We are offering a better deal better jobs, better wages, and a better future. American people deserve real, bipartisan, permanent tax reform that puts the middle class first. The truth is that our colleagues either choose to ignore or do not understand the gravity of the situation, as they say in The Music Man. This is a terrible assault on the middle class. And so tonight, with the Democrats' motion to instruct conferees, we want the Republicans to show where they stand. Will Republicans vote yes to protect vital state and local tax deduction that enables people to live in a safe place? Or will they vote to double tax middle-class families, drive down home values, and endangering key funding for firefighters, law enforcement, and schools? Will Republicans vote to protect the health care of those with pre-existing conditions? No. No, 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 no. Or will they vote to spike families' premiums and add 13 million more Americans to the ranks of the uninsured if this bill goes through? I have said that this, with stiff competition by some of the other things they have put forth, is the worst bill in the history of the United States Congress. Now, how can I make that claim? Well, because it involves more money, hurts more people, increases the deficit by so much more, and just because everything is bigger in our country, the consequences of this bill, a multi-trillion-dollar economy being addressed by a bill that had no hearings, no expert testimony, just with the speed of light, as Jamie Raskin says, the speed of light in the dark of night, here we are. And who else thinks this is not a good idea? This is what the United States Conference of Bishops has said. This proposal appears to be the first federal income tax modification in American history that will raise income taxes on the working poor while simultaneously providing a large tax cut to the wealthy. This, the Conference of Bishops says, this is simply unconscionable, and I believe them. Let us remember the words of St. Augustine. A state which is not governed according to justice would be just a bunch of thieves. He said that 17 centuries ago. When His Holiness Pope Benedict wrote about this in his first encyclical, God is Love, he went on to say sometimes you have to work hard to determine what justice is. But in doing so, you must beware of the dazzling blindness of money and power. Apparently, you do not heed that. Let us look honestly at the GOP tax scam before us. No justice. I urge my colleagues on both sides of the aisle to vote yes on the motion to instruct conferees to at least inject some element of fairness and common sense into this destruction, and then to reject this terrible bill. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentleman from Massachusetts reserves. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yielding myself 30 seconds, I would point out that a hardworking middle-class family in the 12th District of California will see a tax cut of $5,508. I would point out as well that the claim that this is an attack on the middle class received 4 Pinocchios is simply untrue by the Washington Post. And while we're fact-checking, I'll remind the American public that President Obama did inherit a deficit. He inherited from a Democratic House and a Democratic Senate, and then he made it worse. I reserve.
The gentleman from Massachusetts is recognized.
Speaker, might I inquire as to how much time there is remaining?
The gentleman from Massachusetts has 3¼ minutes.
Mr. Speaker, I have no further speakers, and I'm prepared to close at the right time when the
gentleman
chairman...
from Massachusetts is recognized.
Thank you. Mr. Speaker, we've heard this discussion back and forth tonight about tax relief for the middle class. And we've heard the other side say that you're going to get $1,189 for a family of four, I think, making $59,000 a year. But what they don't say is that they're going to take away the state and local tax deduction. They're going to take away the ability of children to deduct interest payments on student debt, that they're going to shave back the mortgage interest deduction, get rid of the historic tax credit, that they're going to get rid of New Markets tax credits, and here's the best one of all. As champions of the middle class they are, they're going to repeal the estate tax. The gentleman from Pennsylvania, who is my friend, he said, we need to stop talking about wealth. Well, how about approaching it this way? We're wealthy and we're not going to take it anymore. Because that's essentially what this argument is about. When you look at the distribution tables as to who gets what in this tax proposal, the concentration of wealth at the very top is highlighted time and again. When we talk about tax relief for the middle class, when we examine what this is about to do to California and New York and Massachusetts and Connecticut, to name but a few of the states that are going to pay a penalty for this tax plan, and I dispute fully what the chairman said about the Obama years. 14 million jobs were created during the Obama years. 23 million jobs were created during the Clinton years. And the day that George Bush left, we were losing 800,000 jobs a month in America. That's the reality. When you look at economic growth during those years, the 2% that we look at was not enough. But it's now been almost 13 years when middle-class people have not had a pay raise. And time and again, we've heard the preposterous argument, and boy, did it get us into trouble, that tax cuts pay for themselves. You cannot find a mainstream economist that will say that tax cuts pay for themselves. And now you hear the repeated argument that if we cut taxes and we add dynamic scoring based upon what might occur or maybe or if, then we're told that this is going to alleviate slow productivity and slow growth in America, all based upon the premise of tax cuts. You know what we should be doing tonight, Mr. Speaker? We should be talking about investing in human capital. We should be talking about the 6 million jobs that go unanswered in America every single day. We should be talking about community colleges. We should be talking about the idea of apprenticeship programs, and yes, investing in vocational education, and also talking about finally what to do about the 2 million people in America who have opiate addictions and don't go to work every day. We should be concerned about the labor participation rate in America. Instead, the answer always becomes the holy grail of Republican economics: cut taxes for the people at the very top and plead the case that what you're really doing is for people in the middle class. The alternative minimum tax is devoted to people at the top, and the idea of repealing the estate tax for so few people in America is outrageous. And with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.
House will come to order. The House will come to order. The House will come to order. The gentleman from Texas is recognized.
Mr. Speaker, I'm prepared to close.
So
this is a clear choice. So opponents of tax reform make this a clear choice. They stand for business as usual, special interests as usual, losing our U.S. jobs overseas as usual, making it hard for young people to come out of school to find good paying jobs as usual, and Washington having a greater claim over your earnings than you do as usual. That's what the opponents of tax reform stand for today. Today is about no more. No more of that. It is time to drain the swamp. It's time to drain this tax code. It is time for a fair and simpler tax code that Americans deserve, to close loopholes and special interest and lower tax rates so hardworking Americans can keep more of what they earn. Say no to the swamp. Say yes to a new tax code and a new era of American prosperity. I urge a no on the motion to recommit, and I yield back.
Chairman yields back. All time for debate has expired. Without objection, the previous question is ordered. The question is on the motion to instruct. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed say no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Speaker. Mr. Speaker, with that, I ask for the yeas and nays.
The yeas and nays are requested. Those favoring a vote by the yeas and nays will rise. A sufficient number having risen, the yeas and nays are ordered. Members will record their votes by electronic device. This is a 15-minute vote.
About an hour and a half ago, the House approved going into negotiation with the Senate on their two separate versions of the Republican tax reform plans. Just now wrapping up a debate on the motion to instruct, the Democratic motion to instruct the conferees, the negotiators that will be participating in the conference we expect later this week. And while not specific on instruction, it was an opportunity for both Republicans to express their support of the measure and Democrats once again in opposition. Our Capitol Hill producer Craig Kaplan tweeting about the earlier vote. It was 222 to 192 to go to conference with the Senate and touch and go there for a little bit in a vote that lasted about 35 minutes. Craig Kaplan tweeting that 7 Republicans who voted no on the House version of the Republican tax bill voted yes to go to the conference with the Senate tonight.